She walked into the throne room and changed the history of a kingdom. Not with a sword, not with an army, with 9 words spoken to a dying king who had sworn an oath he was about to forget. Solomon your son shall be king after you. You swore it. The palace was already buzzing with the sound of another man's coronation feast. Trumpets at a rival ceremony. Chalices raised in a neighboring district. Israel's throne was, in practical terms, already taken. Bathsheba had 1 hour, probably less. What happened in that hour, the way this woman walked into absolute power, spoke with quiet precision, and turned the entire succession of Israel's greatest dynasty, is one of the most remarkable political maneuvers in the ancient world. But to understand it, you have to understand who she was before this moment. And the version of her story most people know is badly incomplete. Here is what the full story actually contains. A girl of perhaps 14, seen from a rooftop. A summons she could not refuse. A pregnancy that put her in danger. A husband so honorable, he unknowingly carried his own death warrant in his hand. A prophet who walked into the palace and told the most powerful king in Israel's history exactly what kind of man he had become. A child who lived 7 days. A grief so absolute, it changed David permanently. And then quietly, over the long years of a palace, she learned to navigate with increasing skill a transformation from a woman things happened to into a woman who made things happen. She began this story on a rooftop with no power at all. She ended it by deciding who would sit on Israel's throne. This is that complete journey. Jerusalem in the years of David's middle reign was a city in full flower. The Jebusites who had built it had believed their hilltop fortress was impenetrable. So impenetrable, they had supposedly said that even the blind and lame could defend it against an army. David's general had found an old water shaft in the rock beneath the city and climbed through the dark. That kind of solution, finding the way through that others couldn't see, defined David's reign. He had taken a city on a hill and made it the center of the world he knew. Cedar from Lebanon, stone cut with Phoenician precision. The Ark of the Covenant settled into the city's heart, transforming it from a political capital into a spiritual one. When the ark arrived, David had danced in the street with such abandon that his wife Michal had been embarrassed on his behalf. He had told her that before the God who chose him over his brothers and over his father's preferences, he would make himself even more undignified than this. He was a man who felt deeply and expressed it completely. The Psalms he wrote during these years are still being sung 3,000 years later. And the city below him, the one he could see from his palace rooftop, was prospering. Enemies had been pushed back or absorbed. Trade flowed along roads that had once been dangerous. Families were raising children who had never known the fear of a Philistine raid. Bathsheba lived in that city. Her husband was Uriah the Hittite, a foreign-born soldier who had chosen to serve Israel's God and Israel's king with a loyalty that would, in the end, be used against him. He was one of David's 37 named mighty men, an elite within the elite. His list of battle honors was long. His reputation for personal integrity was longer. They lived in a house not far from the palace walls. Modest by royal standards, warm by every other measure. She was beautiful. The text says this plainly, without apology. And she was faithful to her household duties, to the ritual practices of the law, to a quiet life that asked no more of the world's powerful men than to be left alone. She could not have known, on any given evening when she climbed to her rooftop to catch the cooler air of Jerusalem's nights, that she was visible from the palace height above her. She could not have known that on one specific evening, the king wasn't sleeping. The text records the detail with what I believe is intentional precision. It was spring, the season when kings go to war, and David did not go. He sent his general Joab. He sent his army. He sent the Ark of the Covenant, which traveled with Israel's armies as a symbol of divine presence in battle. But David himself stayed in Jerusalem. He was sleeping late. He was restless. He was, the text suggests without quite saying so, a man who had won so many battles that he had grown comfortable with delegating them. This is the backstory of what happens next. A man at the peak of his power, without the discipline that danger provides, with too much comfort, and not enough vigilance over the thing that needed most guarding his own heart. He woke one evening near dusk. He walked on his rooftop. He looked out over the city spread below him, and he saw a woman bathing. The sight stopped him. He could have looked away. Any man at any moral crossroads has that first option, to choose not to know. He looked instead. He sent a servant to find out who she was. The servant came back with information that should have functioned as a complete stop sign. "She is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah the Hittite, daughter of one of his counselors, wife of one of his most honored soldiers, currently deployed at David's own command." The servant had told him everything he needed to know to make the right choice. David sent messengers to bring her to the palace anyway. I want to be precise about what this was. She was a subject summoned by the most powerful person in her world, the man who controlled her husband's military assignment, his safety, his future. When kings summon subjects, the subject comes. There is no real option to decline. The courtly language used in such summons, the polite phrasing, the careful euphemism, doesn't change the underlying reality of who holds power and who doesn't. She came. What happened in that palace chamber was not love. It was the abuse of the vast difference in power between them. She returned to her house carrying that knowledge, and a week later, she sent him a message. 3 words. "I am pregnant." David's first plan was elegant in its simplicity, almost gentle in a devastating way. He sent for Uriah from the front lines, claiming he wanted a battlefield report. And when Uriah arrived, dusty from the march, David received him warmly, asked about the campaign with what appeared to be genuine interest, and then told him to go home to his wife. Rest, recover. You've earned it. The implication was clear. Uriah would spend a night with Bathsheba. When the pregnancy became visible, everyone would assume the child was his. Crisis resolved. No scandal. No consequences. It was the kind of plan that works only if the person you're depending on is morally ordinary. Uriah was not morally ordinary. He refused to go home. Instead, he slept at the palace gate with the household guard. When David asked him why, gently, with expressed concern, Uriah gave him an answer that is echoed down through 3,000 years, because it is so uncomplicatedly good. The ark of God is in a tent. Joab and all the troops are camped in open fields. How could I go home to eat and drink and sleep with my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing. While his brothers were in tents, he would not sleep on a soft bed. While they faced arrows, he would not hold his wife. David tried again the next night, hosted a dinner, poured wine generously, steadily, until Uriah was flushed with it, laughed with him, drew him into warmth and ease and the comfortable looseness of a man who has drunk well, then sent him home again. Uriah slept at the palace gate again. David had given his perfect soldier every opportunity to be imperfect. Uriah had declined every one. The king who had the power of life and death over his subjects sat alone in his chamber that night and did the arithmetic. Uriah's virtue had become the most dangerous problem in the palace. By morning, David had made a decision that would follow him for the rest of his life. He wrote a letter to his general, Joab. The instructions were brief, military in tone, precise in their terrible intent. Put Uriah in the front of the fiercest fighting, then withdraw from him, so he will be cut down and die. He sealed it with his royal ring. He gave it to Uriah to carry to the front. The man delivered his own death sentence, unknowing, with the faithful efficiency of a soldier who followed his king's orders without question. The city of Rabbah was the Ammonite capital. Its walls were massive, its defenders experienced, its position on high ground expensive in Israelite lives. Joab read David's letter once, then a second time. He was a man who had served David through decades of impossible situations, who had made difficult choices in service of his king, and who had never flinched from any of them. He didn't flinch now. He found Uriah. He had special work for him, an assault on the strongest section of the wall, where the defenders were thickest and the ground most exposed. Uriah took his position without question. He was a man who trusted his commanders, who believed his king had reasons for things that weren't always explained to soldiers in the field. He led his small force forward, into the most fortified position on the battlefield. He fought well. By all accounts, he fought brilliantly, the text records. The assault with the kind of detail that suggests witnesses who later had reason to remember exactly what they saw. He was still fighting when the others began to fall. The last accounts of him are of a man calling encouragement to men who couldn't hear anymore, holding ground that wasn't worth holding, for reasons he didn't know were false. An arrow found him. The messenger who brought the battle report to Jerusalem had been coached carefully by Joab. If David expressed anger at the tactical error that had sent men too close to the walls, because it was technically an avoidable error, one that violated basic siege warfare principles, the messenger was to add, almost as an afterthought, "And Uriah the Hittite is also dead." David received the report. He heard the planned question, gave the scripted, non-angry response. He sent back a message to Joab, telling him not to be troubled. The sword devours one person as well as another. Press the siege. These things happen. The sword devours one person as well as another. A king's bureaucratic management of the murder of one of his most faithful soldiers. Bathsheba received word of her husband's death from a messenger at her door. She mourned according to custom the full period, the torn garments, the sackcloth, the rituals that gave grief a structure when it had none on its own. What she felt privately during those days, the text leaves us to imagine. She had been carried into something she didn't choose, had become the reason a good man was positioned to die, had no way to speak any of this truth to the neighbors, who came to comfort her with kind words about Uriah's bravery and honor. She knew things about his death that they didn't, and she would carry that knowledge alone. When the mourning period ended, David sent for her. She came to the palace. She became his wife. The text adds one more line, and it is the hinge on which the entire rest of the story turns. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Nathan the prophet walked into David's court on an ordinary morning and told him a story. There were two men in a city. One was rich, owning herds and flocks beyond counting. One was poor, owning a single ewe lamb so precious to him that he had raised it alongside his children, feeding it from his table, letting it drink from his cup, holding it in his arms at night. It was like a daughter to him. A traveler came to the rich man's house. Custom required hospitality, but the rich man, unwilling to take from his own abundant flocks, took the poor man's single lamb and prepared it for his guest's meal. David's response was immediate and furious. "As the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity." Nathan looked at him. "You are the man." 2 words. Hebrew. Ata ha'ish. The entire moral architecture of the past months collapsed into those 4 syllables. Nathan continued. He laid out what David had done with the precision of a prosecutor who has been building a case and is finally ready to deliver the summation. "You were anointed king. You were delivered from Saul. You were given your master's house and his wives. You were given the house of Israel and Judah. If that was too little, God would have added more. Why then did you despise the word of the Lord? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites." And then the sentence, "The sword will never depart from your house, because you despised God and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite." The room was perfectly still. David, who had been prepared to sentence someone else to death for this exact crime 30 seconds ago, sat with the full weight of what he had done settling onto him like stone. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He didn't do what powerful people caught in wrongdoing so often do: explain, justify, reframe, attack the messenger. He said 4 words. "I have sinned against God." Nathan's response carries a mercy as stunning as the accusation had been devastating. "The Lord has put away your sin. You will not die." But the child that Bathsheba carried, the child whose existence had triggered everything that followed, would not live. Bathsheba was not in this throne room. No one consulted her about any of this. The accounting was between David and God and his prophet. She had been the object of the story's crime, but she was not present for its reckoning. She was at home, waiting for a child who was already sentenced. The child was born, and then the child became sick. What David did next astonished everyone in the palace. The most powerful man in Israel stripped off his royal garments. He lay on the ground in sackcloth. He refused all food and water for 7 days. He refused to get up from the floor. Servants who came with bread or wine were sent away. Officials who needed royal decisions were turned away. The kingdom essentially paused. His advisors were baffled. He had mourned Uriah with a single administrative sentence about swords devouring people indiscriminately. He had moved through the whole episode with the composure of a man managing a political situation. And now he was face down on a floor, refusing to eat. What had changed? Nathan's words, the full weight of what he had actually done. Not the political problem, but the moral reality had apparently hit him all at once in the prophet's throne room. And when he was told the child would die, something broke open in him that all the months of careful political management had kept sealed. He was bargaining with God, not politely, with everything. Bathsheba watched her child grow weaker. She watched her husband prostrated on the floor, with a desperation that must have felt, from her position, like both acknowledgement and impossibility. This man, whose choices had brought them to this place, was now visibly, completely breaking. She stayed at her child's side. The baby's breathing grew shallower on the 7th day. David's servants huddled in the corridors, afraid to tell him the news. If he was this undone while the child was merely ill, what would happen when they had to tell him the child was gone? David heard them whispering and understood immediately. He rose from the floor. He washed his face. He changed his clothes. He went to the house of God and worshipped. Then he came home, asked for food, and ate. His servants were stunned. They had the sequence backward in their minds. While the child was alive, he fasted and wept. Now that the child was dead, he ate? David's explanation is one of the most quietly devastating things he ever said. While the child was alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now, he has died. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. He could not reverse what his choices had set in motion. He could not bargain the consequence away. He could face it with grief, or he could face it with faith that the story didn't end at death. He chose the second. Then he went to Bathsheba. He comforted her. He was with her. For the first time in this story, we see something that approaches a genuine encounter between two people. Not a king and a subject. Not a man exercising power over a woman who couldn't refuse. A man coming to a woman who had lost the same child to offer and receive comfort. Bathsheba conceived again. This time, when the child was born strong, healthy, with clear eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. Nathan came to the palace with a specific message. The Lord, the prophet said, loves this child. And then he gave him a name, not the name his parents had chosen. A name from God, Jedediah, beloved of the Lord. The child's given name, the one he would be known by publicly, was Solomon. The word means peace. There is something worth sitting with in that name. David had been at war for most of his life. He had killed his tens of thousands. His hands had been called too blood-stained to build the temple he dreamed of. God had told him that directly. In a moment of personal accounting, David had received without apparent bitterness. The temple would be built by a son born in peace, for peace. Solomon. A declaration of what David hoped might come after everything that had preceded it. The child grew the way children do, from a small, miraculous weight in his mother's arms into a person with recognizable characteristics. He watched everything. He listened to adult conversations with an attention that seemed to exceed what his age should have allowed. When he asked questions, his teachers sometimes found themselves working harder than they expected to answer them adequately. Bathsheba taught him things his tutors couldn't. She taught him to watch the gap between what people said and what they actually meant. A skill she had refined through years of navigating a palace full of people operating at multiple levels simultaneously. She taught him that the most important information in any room is often carried by the people no one is paying attention to. She taught him that mercy, used precisely, could accomplish things that force could not. These were not lessons from Scripture. They were lessons from her life. The years after Solomon's birth were the years in which Bathsheba became herself. Not the young woman glimpsed from a rooftop. Not the terrified new wife trying to survive an impossible situation. Not even the grieving mother lying beside a dying child. Those versions of her were real, but they were not the whole. Palace life is a long education, if you survive it. And she survived it with unusual skill. There were David's other wives, each with their own histories and children and calculations. There were courtiers who had served since before David's kingship began, with loyalties layered and complex. There were the king's sons, multiple sons from multiple mothers, each with his own orbit of supporters and ambitions. She made friends where friendship was genuine. She maintained civil relations where it was strategic. She learned to read the palace's internal weather system the way favor shifted, the signals that preceded a change in a courtier's standing, the early signs of which alliances were forming and which were dissolving. She kept her own counsel in a court full of people who wanted her to reveal it. David's relationship with her deepened over the years, in ways that weren't fully visible to outside observers. The text is careful and spare about their private life. It doesn't give us their conversations, their arguments, the small moments of the long middle of any marriage. But the trajectory of her influence suggests something real had been built between them, something tested by shared loss and found to hold. David came to trust her judgment. He listened to her on matters affecting Solomon's education, matters affecting the household, matters affecting things she had noticed in the palace that he, from his position at the top, couldn't see as clearly. And meanwhile, his own health was declining. Not dramatically, not suddenly. The king was aging. The man who had run through the hills with a sling, who had danced with his whole body before the ark, who had fought hand to hand in battles his generals had since turned into legend. That man was becoming an old one. The question of what came next was beginning to press against the surface of every political conversation in Jerusalem. David had many sons. The oldest surviving one was Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith. He was handsome, the text says. His father had never crossed him with a word of discipline, never asked him to explain or reconsider his choices. He had grown up in the warmth of paternal adoration and the assumption that his birthright was secure. He began to act like a king before he was one. 50 men ran before his chariot when he traveled through Jerusalem, a display of royal pretension that would have been unmistakable to anyone who understood such signals. He began cultivating relationships with the specific people who mattered for a succession. Joab, David's old military commander, whose loyalty had survived everything, including the letter about Uriah, but who had never quite forgiven being occasionally bypassed. Abiathar the priest, one of the 2 high priests of Israel, whose institutional authority could lend religious legitimacy to a coronation. These were the pillars of a parallel court being constructed within the existing one. Notably absent from Adonijah's coalition, Nathan the prophet, who had been at David's side since the famous accusation, and whose voice carried divine authority. And Zadok the priest, Nathan's counterpart in formal religious power. And Benaiah, commander of David's personal bodyguard. These 3 clustered around Solomon, whether by calculation or conviction. And Bathsheba watched all of it. She watched who was paying attention to Adonijah and how. She watched which merchants were beginning to develop relationships with him, which military commanders were finding reasons to attend his gatherings, which palace officials were starting to position themselves for a different court. She tracked the drift of loyalties the way a weather observer tracks wind patterns, not for casual interest, but because the storm they indicated was heading toward her son. Then Adonijah made his move. He held a sacrificial feast at the stone of Zoheleth, near Enrogel, outside Jerusalem's walls. He invited his brothers. He invited the men of Judah who served the king. He invited Joab, and Abiathar. He did not invite Solomon. He did not invite Nathan. He did not invite Benaiah. He did not invite Bathsheba. He declared himself king. The news reached Bathsheba while the feast was in full noise. Nathan arrived at her chambers within minutes of the news. He had a plan. It was simple, timed precisely, built on one thing David still had that Adonijah hadn't been able to take yet: an oath. David had sworn to Bathsheba, privately, in terms as clear as an oath can be, that Solomon would sit on his throne after him. That oath had been given. It had not been publicly invoked, and an old king who couldn't leave his bed might not have received clear information about what was happening at the feast outside the walls. Nathan's plan. Bathsheba goes in first. She reminds David of the oath, informs him Adonijah has declared himself king, makes him understand the stakes. Then Nathan enters, confirms the crisis, reinforces the prophetic dimension. Two people David trusted completely. Two credible voices arriving in rapid sequence with the same urgent message. No time for Adonijah's allies in the palace to intervene. Bathsheba prepared herself with the specific care of someone who understood that every detail of the next few minutes would matter. The right garments, the right posture, the right tone, not hysterical, not cold, precisely calibrated. Urgent, without panic. Respectful, without weakness. She walked through the corridors of the palace she had learned over decades. Servants stepped aside. Guards recognized her. She moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had been going to this room for years and had never once shown anything in her face that she didn't intend to show. David was in his private chamber. The aged king who had once run toward giants now lay in bed. An elderly man whose body was finally declining below the level his will demanded. He saw her face and asked what she wanted. She bowed, she rose, and then she said what she had come to say. "My lord, you swore to me by the Lord your God, Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he shall sit on my throne. But now Adonijah has become king, and you, my lord the king, do not know it." She described what was happening. The feast, the men invited, the men excluded, the trumpets that were already sounding. "And now, my lord the king, the eyes of all Israel are upon you, to tell them who will sit on the throne after you. Otherwise, when you lie down with your fathers, I and Solomon will be counted as criminals." That last sentence, not an appeal to sentiment, not a plea for her own sake, a clear-eyed statement of the political reality if Adonijah consolidated his claim before David acted. Everyone who hadn't supported him would face consequences, including Solomon, including her. She had given David the information and the stakes. Now she stepped back and let him think. Nathan arrived as planned. He confirmed everything. David's response came without hesitation. He summoned Zadok the priest. He summoned Nathan. He summoned Benaiah. He issued direct, specific orders. Take Solomon down to the Gihon spring. Anoint him there. Sound the trumpets and declare, "Long live King Solomon." Then bring him up on my mule, and he shall come and sit on my throne. The old king's voice, in the moment of his final decisive act, carried all the authority of 40 years on Israel's throne. The coronation at Gihon moved with the swift certainty of events that have been prepared for and released at exactly the right moment. Zadok the priest carried the horn of sacred oil, the same oil used to anoint David himself in those distant fields outside Bethlehem. He poured it over Solomon's head with the ritual words, the ancient formula of divine appointment. The oil ran down over a young man who had spent years studying the principles of governance and was now, abruptly, living them. Solomon's composure in this moment was noticed. He had not known that morning that his coronation would happen today. He had woken to a crisis and was now riding his father's mule through the streets as the trumpets began. He moved through it all with a stillness that suggested not indifference, but depth, a man whose reaction to sudden elevation was to become more settled, not less. The trumpets were answered by people who hadn't known they were waiting for a signal. The city erupted. The crowd that gathered grew as the procession moved, people running in from the market stalls, from the temple courts, from the homes along the route, joining the celebration with the unrehearsed enthusiasm of a people who recognized something legitimate when it happened. "Long live Solomon!" The sound rolled across Jerusalem's hills, amplified by stone and joy. At the feast outside the walls, Joab heard it first. The old commander had enough military experience to read the meaning in distant sound. Trumpets from the direction of Gihon, a particular character of crowd noise. Not concern, not alarm. Celebration. The specific building quality of a city receiving news it approves of. The messengers arrived at the feast before the sound could fully be explained away. Solomon had been anointed. David had commanded it. The king's own mule had carried the new king. The priests and the prophet had officiated. The feast at Zolith dissolved in the time it takes to understand that you've been outmaneuvered. Solomon came home to Jerusalem as king. The city received him with the specific joy that belongs to settled succession. Not the excitement of surprise, but the relief of clarity. The satisfaction of an outcome that felt right to people who had been uncertain for too long. He entered his father's throne room and sat down. David received him there. The old king's eyes held something that might have been the deepest satisfaction of his life. Not the victory over Goliath, not the capture of Jerusalem, not any of the military and political achievements that had defined his public legacy. His son, on his throne, by divine appointment, and by his own last decisive command. The line would continue. The covenant promise would find its expression in the next generation. Bathsheba entered that room as Queen Mother. The title carried a specific weight in the ancient world, greater than wife, different from Queen Regnant. The Queen Mother in Israel held a formal position at court, occupied a throne of her own, exercised influence through access to the king that no other advisor had. When Solomon later received her in formal audience, he rose from his throne, bowed to her, and had a throne placed at his right hand for her to sit. He bowed to his mother, the king of Israel, the wisest man who would ever live, bowing to the woman who had first taught him to watch what people didn't say. There is a proverb in the book of Proverbs attributed to a king's mother. Do not give your strength to women, or your ways to those who destroy kings. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Ensure justice for those being crushed. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. These instructions to a son who would be king. The fingerprints of a woman who had navigated every version of powerlessness and had come out with a precise understanding of where justice was most needed. Scholars have long debated who this mother was, but the words fit Bathsheba's story with the exactness of a key made for a specific lock. The dream came at Gibeon, early in Solomon's reign. He had offered 1,000 burnt offerings at the great high place there, and God appeared to him that night in a dream. The offer was open. Extraordinary, ask for whatever you want me to give you. A young king, with the whole of Israel's complicated legacy spread before him. Enemies to manage, alliances to build, a civil war narrowly avoided, a father's shoes to fill that could not possibly be filled by the same means that had created them. David had been a warrior. Solomon was a scholar. He could have asked for long life, for riches, for the death of his enemies. These would have been understandable requests. He asked for wisdom, specifically a discerning heart to govern his people, and to distinguish between right and wrong. Because, he said, who can govern this great people of yours? God's response carried a specific warmth. Since you have asked for this, and not for long life, or wealth, or the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. And then, I will also give you what you have not asked for, both riches and honor. The test of that wisdom came quickly. 2 women, 1 living child, each claiming the child was hers. No witnesses, no evidence. 2 equally impassioned, equally credible testimonies, in absolute contradiction. Solomon listened to both. Then he called for a sword. Divide the living child in 2, he said. Give half to one and half to the other. 1 woman accepted. 1 woman cried out in anguish, give her the child. Don't kill it. Let the other woman have it. Solomon pointed to the second woman. Give her the child. She is the mother. The logic was precise and devastating. The woman willing to surrender the child rather than see it harmed was the one whose love for it was real. The first woman had been willing to destroy what she couldn't have. Only a mother would choose the child's life over her own claim. Bathsheba, watching from her position as queen mother, saw her son do in public what she had spent years teaching him in private. Read what was underneath the words, not just the words themselves. David had wanted to build the temple. The desire had come to him as both a personal and spiritual ambition. The Ark of the Covenant still resting in a tent, while the king himself lived in a house of cedar. It seemed backward. He drew up plans. He assembled materials on a scale that could only be described as obsessive. Gold, silver, bronze, iron, cedar, stone. He began gathering it across decades of his reign. And then God had told him, directly, that he was not the one who would build it. The reason given: David had shed blood, made war. The temple was to be built in peace, by a man of peace. The name Solomon Peace had been waiting for this from the beginning. Construction began in the 4th year of Solomon's reign. It would take 7 years to complete. The specifications were precise and vast. The temple itself was not enormous by ancient standards, but the courts and storerooms and side chambers and supporting infrastructure made it a complex that transformed the hilltop of Jerusalem into something the ancient world came from great distances to see. Cedar from Lebanon floated down the coast on rafts and hauled up to Jerusalem. Stone cut in the quarry so precisely that no hammer or axe or iron tool was heard at the building site. Everything arrived already shaped. Gold overlaid every interior surface. 2 cherubim of olive wood, 15 feet tall, stood in the inner sanctuary with wings spread to touch both walls and each other. When the priests carried the ark into the inner sanctuary, and the cloud of God's presence filled the temple so completely that the priests couldn't stand to minister. David's dream, given to his son to build. Bathsheba's son, completing what her husband had only been allowed to prepare. She stood in the courts during the dedication ceremony and watched the smoke rise from the sacrifices and the cloud settle into the new temple, and heard Solomon's prayer. A prayer about foreigners and failures and repentance, and the God who hears from heaven, and understood that the story she had been living inside was larger than any of its individual catastrophes or triumphs. In her later years, Bathsheba sometimes returned to the palace rooftop where this story had found her. Not the same rooftop. The palace Solomon built surpassed his father's in scale and grandeur, but the view, the spread of Jerusalem across its hills, the temple now visible to the east, the roads leading away in every direction, the smoke of cooking fires and the sounds of a city had the same quality that all high places have when you've lived long enough to know what you're looking at. She had come to this city as a young woman, with no power and no choice. She had been carried into situations she didn't design and couldn't control, and yet she had survived each of them, not by becoming something other than herself, not by hardening, not by surrendering her capacity for love or grief or hope, which would have been the easiest way to stop being hurt. She had survived by becoming more completely herself, more observant, more precise, more able to distinguish what was real from what only appeared to be. The palace had been her education. Loss had been her teacher. Patience had been her method. She had watched her first child die and learned that some things cannot be bargained away, only endured and then carried forward. She had watched her second child grow into a king of legendary wisdom and learned that the most important things you teach your children are the ones you teach by example, before they're old enough to understand they're being taught. She had watched a palace full of people in motion, chasing power, building alliances, maneuvering around each other with the elaborate choreography of the politically ambitious and learned, that the quietest person in the room often understands it best. She was that person. The Book of Kings records only a handful of her direct speeches, but the moments those speeches appear are the hinge points of the entire narrative, the places where the story pivots. When Bathsheba spoke, things changed. A woman who had been defined by what others did to her had become a woman who determined what happened next. For 3,000 years, Bathsheba has been called a seductress. She has been blamed for what a king chose to do with his power. She has been described as complicit, as ambitious, as a woman who bathed where she knew she could be seen. The tradition of making the victim responsible for the actions of the powerful is ancient and persistent. But the text does not support this reading. It places the moral weight of what happened precisely where Nathan placed it, on David. The prophet came to the king with his accusation, not to Bathsheba. The sheep in the parable was the innocent victim, not the one who acted. "You are the man," was said to David, not to her. She never acts in the story's first movement. Things are done to her. She is summoned. She is taken. She is told her husband is dead. She becomes a wife. She becomes a mother. She watches her child die. All of these are passives, not because she was passive, but because the active power in that chapter of the story was not hers. The real scandal, Nathan made clear, was precisely the opposite of what the centuries-long tradition of blaming her implies. A man who had been given everything: throne, power, wives, wealth, the favor of God. So extraordinary that God himself called him a man after my own heart, had looked down at a woman with nothing, a woman who couldn't refuse him, and taken what wasn't his. The abuse of power is more scandalous than the exploitation of powerlessness. That is what Nathan was saying. That is what David, to his lasting credit, agreed with. Bathsheba understood this. She had lived inside it, which is perhaps why, when she taught Solomon about justice, she told him to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves, to defend the rights of the poor and the needy, to judge fairly. She knew what it was to be in a position where no one was speaking for you. She became a woman who made sure others didn't stay there. After Solomon was crowned, Adonijah came to Bathsheba with a request. Of all the people in Israel he could have approached, he came to the queen mother, the man whose failed bid for the throne had nearly cost Solomon everything, whose party had scattered at the sound of Gihon's trumpets, whose ambitions had been clearly and completely overturned. He came to the woman whose intervention had undone him. He asked her to ask Solomon for a concession on his behalf. It was either very bold or very stupid, or possibly both. What it reveals is something about the reputation she had built. He didn't go to Zadok the priest, who had officiated at Solomon's anointing. He didn't approach Nathan, who had prophesied Solomon's kingship. He didn't try to find another path. He went to Bathsheba, because somewhere in his reading of the political landscape, he had come to the conclusion that she was someone whose intercession might actually work, someone who might choose mercy over the pursuit of his total destruction, someone whose power was real and whose character was trustworthy. Bathsheba took his request to Solomon. Solomon's response to the specific thing Adonijah asked for is complicated. It carried political implications that made him see it as a continuing threat to his throne, and he responded accordingly. But the act of bringing the request, of choosing to advocate rather than to dismiss, that tells us something. She had been inside enough abuse of power to know what unnecessary cruelty looked like. She didn't mistake necessary political reality for unnecessary cruelty. But she also didn't allow her son's reign to begin in a spirit of pure vengeance, when mercy was available. This is the complexity of someone who has thought carefully about power, not the person who uses it without reflection, and not the person who refuses to use it out of false modesty, but the person who uses it with full awareness of what it costs and what it buys. There is a genealogy in the opening verses of the New Testament that lists the ancestors of Jesus. Matthew, who wrote it, made a notable choice. Most genealogies in the ancient world listed only men, fathers begetting sons, in an unbroken patrilineal chain. Matthew's includes 4 women, each of them notable for unconventional circumstances. Tamar, who was denied her legal rights and took drastic action to claim them. Rahab, the woman of Jericho who sheltered the Israelite spies, and whose red cord hangs in the wall of biblical memory. Ruth, the foreign widow who chose loyalty over safety and became an ancestor of kings. And the wife of Uriah, not Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah. Matthew's intentional use of her identity as Uriah's wife, long after she had become David's wife, and long after Uriah had been dead for generations, is striking. It's a way of keeping the story honest. It names the sin. It keeps present the person who was wronged and the woman who bore that wrong. But she's there, in the lineage. Her son Solomon is in the list. Rehoboam, Abiah, Asa. The line continues through her. And at the end of the genealogy, 42 generations from Abraham, Jesus of Nazareth. The story that began on a Jerusalem rooftop, on a quiet evening, with a young woman bathing in her courtyard, while a king walked his palace and looked out over the city he had been given. That story runs all the way through the center of the oldest continuous narrative in Western civilization. She did not know this. She couldn't have. She knew the palace she navigated, the son she raised, the dynasty she helped secure. But the God who sees, the El Roi that Hagar named in the desert, the God who had sent Nathan to David's throne room with those two precise words, that God was doing something with her story that she couldn't see the shape of from inside it. The genealogy is, among other things, a statement about what gets preserved, not the perfection of people, not the cleanness of their origins. The faithfulness of God working through the full complexity of human failure and resilience toward purposes that exceed any single life. Bathsheba's story is in that line. In the 23rd Psalm, which David wrote, there is a line that has never stopped traveling. He leads me beside still waters. The original Hebrew, Mei Menuchot, waters of resting, waters of peace after movement. David, who spent his early years with literal sheep beside literal streams, wrote this about the relationship between a soul and the God who guides it. But it captures something about what Bathsheba's story becomes and its long conclusion. The woman who had been thrown into motion by other people's choices, carried from her quiet life into crisis, from crisis into the palace's complex currents, from grief to political battle, to the exhausting work of raising a future king in the middle of a trauma. Dynasty's most unstable years eventually arrived at something that might be called still waters. Not peace through the absence of difficulty, peace that had been earned by surviving difficulty and finding that the thing that sustained her through it was still there on the other side. She had been a girl caught in a rooftop glance she hadn't invited. She had been a wife whose husband died because her king was afraid of his own virtue. She had been a mother who held a dying child, and then a thriving one. She had been a woman in a palace full of powerful people with their own agendas, learning to read every current and navigate it with the skill of someone who couldn't afford to be wrong. She had been the person who walked into the dying king's chamber and said 9 words that changed Israel's history. And in the end, she was the queen mother in a golden age. Solomon's reign brought prosperity and peace, and a wisdom so famous that monarchs traveled from distant countries to ask him questions. The temple stood on the hill David had dreamed it on. The gold that had been gathered over decades now lined the walls of the house of God. Bathsheba stood in those courts and watched it happen. There is a question her story keeps asking across the 3,000 years since it was written down. What makes a person remarkable? Is it the circumstances they're born into, or the ones they're thrown into by forces they don't control? Is it the choices they make when they have options, or the way they survive when they don't? Bathsheba had almost nothing to recommend her at the start of this story, except her faithfulness to an ordinary life. And it was that faithfulness, that steady and undramatic commitment to being fully present in each version of the life she was handed, that eventually produced a woman capable of saving a kingdom with 9 words. She didn't know on that rooftop evening that she was living inside a story this large. None of us ever do. The still waters come to those who keep moving through the difficult ones. If this story touched something in you, a question about surviving things you didn't choose, about what happens after the worst chapters, about the way God works through the full complexity of human lives, leave that in the comments. These conversations matter, and if you want to stay with these stories, the ones that go deeper than the familiar versions, that follow the full arc of people whose lives changed history. Subscribe, because there are more, much more. God bless you. See you in the next one.